So most of the time, you're not going to find the mycorrhizal mushrooms fruiting before really we start to get into summer. And then, it is governed always by rainfall patterns, but it tends to peak August into September with the mycorrhizal species. So the earliest boletes I typically find are in June. And there's one type of porcini that I find in a couple of white pine stands that comes in June when nothing else is around, or very few other mycorrhizals. But most of the time it's later, summer to late fall. And I just want to point out, this is called the graceful bolete. And I almost never have found more than one at a time. It's long, stalk, little cap, beautiful, almost felted cap. I find it with hemlocks. I put it up there because it's beautiful. Apparently edible, I've never eaten it. And this is just one of those beautiful boletes. This is the gray bolete, Retiboletus griseus, and it's just gloriously beautiful in its own right. So, edibility, some of the most highly prized internationally mushrooms are boletes. That thing the Europeans call Boletus agilis, and now we're starting to recall it here now as we look more into the taxonomy. It is collected and used in so many countries. It has so many names. We know it as porcini, pinnibun, the king bolete, Steinpilz, Phlegenpilz is related. That's actually the fly agate. Elia grib if you're Russian. Blanco hongo down in Mexico, in the Mexican highlands. Just so many different names because it's revered. So some really, really great edibles. And they're productive and dependable. In the state of Maine, under white pine forest, there's one that we call the slippery Jill a lot. It's a swillis. And some years, you could just about walk across a pine forest on top of the caps, if that was your destructive tendencies. So others are a little bit harder to find. Now, coming from Europe, in some of the really mycophilic cultures where they just embrace and love all mushrooms, they say, well, really all boletes are edible. Well, there's those ones that have the red pores that stain blue. Some of those will sicken you, but other than that, they're all edible. And I really try and nuance that messaging. My story is, one time I've been sickened by a mushroom. Early August 1986. I remember it really well. And I'll show you that mushroom in a bit, and I was out in the woods near Gutchbrook Lake, and I found a number of fruitings of this just really dense, non-buggy, kind of lilac, purplish brown mushroom, and some larger ones were brown. And I collected a bunch of them, and I brought it home. And I sat down with the books I had at that point to say, all right, what the heck do I have? I keyed it out to, at that point it was called Tylopolis eximius, called the lilac brown bolete. And my Audubon Field Guide to North American Mushrooms, published in 1978 initially, had it in it. As a couple older books did, they called it in. Audubon said no toxic lookalikes. So with that bolding me up, I cooked it up for lunch, sauteed it with some garlic and olive oil, added some cream, salt and pepper, had it over linguine with some Parmesan cheese. Sounded wonderful, huh? It was lovely. It was lovely for about 2.5 hours. And then I started, my stomach started doing flips. I had gone to work. I was working as a bartender at the time. And I said, something about that mushroom didn't agree with me. I thought I would throw up and that would be it. And, within about 45 minutes, I was basically lying behind the bar. We hadn't opened yet. And my coworkers called an ambulance. Took me to the emergency department where they were controlling my nausea and vomiting. And I was sick for about 10 hours. I got very, very interested in that bolete. So did I misidentify it? No, nothing else. Yeah, it's got to be that. So I talked to a man who at that point was known as the guru of Sligo Road, Sam Ristich. He's passed now, but so knowledgeable and so generous with his information. I said, Sam, what do you know about this bully? And he was doing poison control work at the time. He said, well, we've had a couple of people, 2 or 3 people over the next couple of years who've ended up in emergency departments said they ate that bully. I wouldn't touch it. I said, I agree with him. And I've had people come from Europe with that mindset, doesn't stain blue, doesn't have those red pores, gotta be edible. And a lot of other people looking at old literature. So don't make easy assumptions about groups of mushrooms. And we'll talk about a couple others in that respect. And yet, everybody who begins to know bolete wants to learn the bicolor bolete. It is by far one of my favorite boletes. I like it better than the porcini group. I love finding it, I love drying them. It took me probably 6 years of collecting them to settle in to say, all right, I know this one. Because this is going to be a really confusing group. We'll talk a little bit more about them. But the ones that I really worry about toxicity, the lilac brown bolete, that Boletus heronensis that I call the hurler, and some of the red and yellow boletes that stain blue. And there's been an emphasis on, particularly in Facebook posts, of people trying to rehabilitate the edibility of that group. And like Boletus sensibilis, it was always considered poisonous. Now they're considering it edible, and they're considering it edible here. And yet, every year, doing poison control work, I have people who are sickened eating those red and yellow boletes with yellow pores that stain blue. So be cautious. That's my suggestion. Now, boletes in terms of deadly, no, there's no deadly boletes. But if your health is already compromised, it can be deadly. And how many people, raise your hands, how many people really love to throw up? Yeah, me too. Yeah. So be aware of that. So the universal characteristics. You've got a mushroom. Oops, not that one. It's a new pointer. I guess it doesn't have one of those. All right. You've got a mushroom that has classic, we call it a hamburger bun stem, oftentimes, with a central stalk. And if you cut it down longitudinally, you see that layer of tubes that are cleanly separated from the rest of the flesh of the cap. And those tubes can be wide or deep, or they can be shallow, and that's a characteristic to look at. The cap, the stalk, the tubes, the flesh all have color. The cap and stem may have hair or scales or sliminess. The color may change upon bruising. We'll talk about that in a minute. So those are the kinds of characteristics, if you look through your field guide and you read the descriptions, that's what they're going to be talking about. They're going to talk about a size of the cap, and they'll give you a range. These days it's usually in centimeters, from like 5 centimeters to 10, or 5 centimeters to 25 for something that sometimes it's really large. They'll give you a length and width of the stalk. So those are the information you're going to begin to gather by observation. The one piece that I'm going to always urge you to add, pay attention. Where did I find this? Was it clearly under oaks? Was it maybe in mixed woods? Was it under pine? So that tree association can be really important. Now, some of them you'll find on the stem, there's evidence of a ring or that partial veil. Many of them don't, but that's important information as well. So in a typical day, and this was probably 15 years ago, I was walking in the woods, and I can look at this now and say, you're in mixed deciduous woods, mostly oak. But you can find a big range of boletes. Last year, when did boletes hit their peak? Wicked early, like the 3rd, 4th week in July. There were all kinds of boletes all over the place. Usually, it's a month or so later, depending on rainfall pattern. But that's not at all unusual in a forest. You can get really overwhelmed by the varieties and numbers. Suggestion, when you're starting, pick a bulb that you're curious about, or two, maybe three if you're ambitious, and focus on those to learn. And once you have those down and you kind of got it integrated, move on. How many of you have come home with a basket full of mushrooms of different kinds? And you look at it and say, I'm going to figure out what they are. And it's just so wicked intimidating. And that basket becomes just wonderful compost material. I've done that over and over again. So without the labels, this is another one. This was taken a couple years ago. It's in this little section of woods that I don't know about you. How many people here have that section of forest you visit every year, repeatedly? Maybe your property, maybe a property you love. I don't live next to a forest, but there are some woods scattered across the areas I normally cover in the state. I visit as often as I can. It's kind of like that guy in Pennsylvania, blanking on his name, Learn Your Land. It's learning the seasonality of your forest. So this was an area up near Muggetuck Lake that I used to work for the man who owned part of the property. And I always go back up to that area because I know it. There's some things I love in it. And it's variety of ages and stages and species of trees that brings me lots of different mushrooms. So let me talk about some of the things you want to learn about the parts of the mushroom. That underside of the cap, those tubes, that's called the pore layer. And pores come with size of openings and shape of the openings and arrangement. So this is an outlier. This is the ash-loving bowlead. It's an outlier in so many ways. It doesn't have a regular round cap. It's often irregular. It can be asymmetric. And these pores, it's like they're pores on steroids, right? They're large, they're angular, they're kind of arranged with some radial pattern. They're just beautiful. And these are pores that are that color, they stay that color pretty much their whole life. They're a little bit more yellow in the early on. And they don't stain, they don't change color if you bruise it. So the tube layer can be thin or thick. This one's relatively thin. They're different shape. They can have different colors. And the colors are pretty much across the spectrum, other than no blues, no greens, but you can have white to off-white to deep, dark red, almost brown red, to orange, to yellow, to just all over the place. Yeah. And over time, as they mature, that color of the pore surface can change. And some of that you want to look for. Some of it is a little bit more unexpected. And like with a guild mushroom, you can do a spore print or spore deposit to get the color of the spores. And you do that by taking that surface, you cut the bottom of the stem off near the tube layer, and you put it on a piece of paper or a sheet of glass, it's lovely, and you cover it over. You cover it over with a bowl to keep the air currents away, and over time, 4 hours is usually plenty. You get a deposit of the spores, which gives you the color and also a mirror image of the pattern of the gills or the pores in this area. So they're beautiful. And that color of pores, or color of spores, can be important information. So here's some difference in pore color and size and shape. This guy, I think they call this the gray bowlead some places. It doesn't have a really good common name. For years, my friend Michaeline and I would find this occasionally up in northern Washington County, or northern Hancock County, southern Washington County, when we were up there in the summer. We teach a 5-day mushrooming workshop up there. And we found it like 3 times over 12 years. Then 3 years ago, I found it in a graveyard near where I live in Rockland, under a spruce tree. And for 3 years, it's been coming multiple flushes every year, where we found 3 individuals in 12 years. So universally not very common, but I've got a lot more. Interesting thing about this, when you do one of those spore prints, the flesh lying on the paper stains the paper blue. It's the only mushroom we know of that does that. Interesting. So tan, that top left one is the bitter bolete. That pore surface starts out white and then goes to pinkish and then to brownish as it develops. That discolor, I don't know a common name for that, when that first opens up, it's this deepest red. And then as it ages and gets larger, it's like it gets washed out toward orange. Calciporus rubenalis is one of the peppery boletes. Little guy, beautiful, gorgeous pores. And that's the one with the woolly bear on it. That's that bolete that's sickened me, Sartorius eximius, or the lilac brown. And I took this one just because when I turned this over, this is Neohelix albularis, the white-lipped snail, the largest native land snail in North America, and he was chomping away on it. There's a woman who wrote a book 10 years ago or so called The Sound of a Wild Snail Eating. It's a beautiful book about her own chronic illness and dealing with deep chronic illness. And there was a period of time she was bedridden. And someone brought her a plant, and out of that plant crawled a white-lipped snail. And she would watch it. These are mostly nocturnal. It would come out at night, and it would wander around out of the plant, out of the pot. She said, I had a notebook that I kept notes and writings on. And one night, it kind of ate into that notebook, a perfectly square-shaped hole. And she could hear it. She could hear the sound of it eating. And so she wrote the book based on that. And then she said, Greg, I know you're always in the woods. Can you find some of those for me to photograph? At that point, I had never seen one alive. And I said, sure, I'll try. Didn't see any. She reached out to me the next year. So I started saying, all right, where am I going to find them? I can't stop seeing them now. Beautiful. Anyway, I'm going aside. So let's get on. Let's talk about the bruising reaction, which is really often specific to this group, and not all mushrooms. So if you pick it and you scratch your fingernail across that pore surface or break the flesh, some of these will stain blue or bluish green, some actually reddish. And sometimes that staining reaction is like immediate and big, and sometimes it's really subtle and gentle, but it's diagnosis. It follows that species. And it's pretty consistent in the species, so this is two different. That blue on the top is this beautiful blue gyroporus. It has, it's called blue staining bolete, that I find irregularly. It likes kind of sandy, gravelly soil. Lovely edible. And just immediately bright blue. And this is a Carminipes. It's been recently reclassified. Again, very rapid blue staining. And it's a reaction to when you break the cell wall reacting to oxygen. It makes that color change.
But I wasn't expecting that as they grew that their pore color would change. But does the spore print color still stay?
The spores always remain the same constant color. It's the tissue, inside the cells that stains. So you can see this one, I just figured out what this was. I collected this probably 7 years ago. And even handling it to pick was so sensitive. The blue bruising just was kind of picking it over.
And is that bruising only on the stem, or is it on also the spores?
For this it would have been on all parts. All parts immediately. Yes.
Yeah, can you clarify again? Earlier you said something about avoid a stained blue.
Yeah,
and
so
here you're saying, oh, this was absolutely delicious. And there's blue.
Yeah.
Can you be more precise about what you're suggesting?
I couldn't have asked for a better question. So, there is this past belief, and it's a generalization that says if a bolete has pore surface that are red, or starts red, and when you bruise it, it stains blue, that's a bad one. And there are some, particularly European and one in the West Coast, that are really severely reactive with those characteristics. But staining blue is just information. Some blue stainers, even some blue stainers with red pores, are good edibles. Others are not. Generalities, almost always with mushrooms. fail to cover everything. So, and we're going to talk about a couple of the blue stainers. We're going to talk a lot about this non-edulous that's up there. This is the hurling bolete. And I want people to know about it because the reactions from eating that can be very severe, including hospitalization. Really severe. So we're going to talk about those. But blue is just information. And this gorgeous little land moa, again, a newly established genus. It's one of the yellow pored, red cap, blue staining boletes. And you know, I must say, now I know bicolor, I know them well, but the topography of the mushrooms that have those characteristics still defies easy identification. So play with them, learn them, observe them, be careful eating them. Here's another one. And this one, everything stains so deeply, darkly blue, almost immediately. Fun to do with kids. Absolutely fun to do with kids. So let's talk about some of the groups. Everything started out in the genus Boletus, right? And early on, many, many years ago, they're broken down into 4 major genera within that. Boletus still remains fairly large, and everything keeps getting pulled out of the Boletus genus into other genera. Lexinum, also known as the scaper stalks. We'll talk about some of those. Deceptively challenging to identify. We're going to talk about the Swillus, and we're going to talk about Tylopolis. The other ones, I'm going to mention some of them. I'll just give you a view of them so I don't overwhelm you. So the Lexinum they called scaper stalks. When I started mushrooming, the early field guides I had said, you know, Lexinum, that's a safe genera to start eating. And the Lexinum, the Aurantiacum, the orange cap or red cap scaper stalks have been eaten in Europe forever. Many people eat them here, and yet there's a whole lot of cryptic species. In other words, any field guide you have might talk about 3 or 4 Lexinums, and there's a whole lot more. So you make a lot of assumptions. And some people eat these and love them, and every other year, I deal with a sickening with this mushroom group. There was a 30-year summation of mushroom poisonings in the country, and about 3% of the toxic reactions among mushrooms were Lexinum, which is pretty significant in a group that was always considered safe. So they call the scaper stalks because on the stalk, those dark little clusters of black hairs, and they can be black or brown or reddish. Those are the scapers, and you can feel them. They have texture. They stand out from the stem, and sometimes they're really thick, and sometimes they're thinner. So I'm not even going to go down into species on the Swillus because they can be challenging. This is the oak-loving Swillus, or excuse me, Lexinum, oak-loving scaper stalk. That is albellum, small, very distinctive. That's one that's very easy. Many people eat it, not particularly good. And you know, the determination to species on macroscopic level is about staining, how quickly or rapidly the flesh stains. It's about the color and shape of the cap. It's about the color of the scabers and how dense they are. And it's always, 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 what is the tree that it's associated with? These can be very specific. The genus Swillus is another big group, more than 100 species. And these ones, I call this the conifer lovers. Because invariably they are growing symbiotically with some form of conifer. Pine, larch, spruce. Many of them have slimy caps called viscid. And some people say, I don't like that, or it disagrees with me. That sliminess does tend to act as a laxative. Some of us might desire that, some of us might not. Some group especially, has what are called glandular dots or smears. I love the term smear. So this little the pale swillus up here, that's a perfect example of smears. And when it's fresh, if you run your finger on it, it's the sliminess just in little glandular patches. They have often large and angular pore openings when it's mature. And some of them, though not this one photographed, have a partial veil that leaves a part of a ring on the stalk. And again, sometimes very specific. This little Swillus acidus, you can see that partial veil, part of it on the edge of the cap. Again, slimy, and it's acidus because it's tangy. It's a little bit limiting, the taste of it. And we'll talk about the painted bolete that's on the left there more. So these are some of them of the Swillus, and I didn't even spend a lot of time naming the species. Ones you might want to learn is these two center. This is called Swillus weaveri, the one I call slippery Jill. It's under white pine. And you often, in a wet June, we may see a few in June. And then in September, early October, I even found some in early November. They can be all over the place. When they're young and firm, they're a good edible. Not incredible, but good. To start with, they're very distinctive. But there's some lookalikes. The one on the top left, Grevillea, I don't know a common name. It's one that grows with two-needle pine. Or excuse me, this is the two-needle pine. That's the one that grows with larch.
Okay.
Yes.
Right. I see like one of the veils on that. Is that one of the distinct?
So this is a Swillus that does have that partial veil that will have a ring. So does the Swillus ring, Grevillea up top. Yeah. And this one, Swillus cavipes. What do you think cavipes mean? It means a hole in the foot. So it's taller. Again, that's one of the large ones. And I only find that further north. This photograph came from Washington County. So the genus Tylopolis, and this is my term for it, I call these the often bitter ones. There's some of them are just lovely edibles, and some of them you expect to be edible. They're so robust and big and firm and beautiful, and they're wicked bitter. Anybody here have that genetic predilection to not taste bitter? For you, these are edible. The rest of us won't like them. So they're a mix of boring browns. Often really challenging to differentiate early on. They're beautiful. Last year, there were so many Tylopolis. And one of them, Marlely, I finally started eating it. It's just a lovely mushroom. But this one, this is the bitter bolete. This is the one that's often confused for the Boletus edulis group. But they may or may not have net veining or reticulation on the stalk. And can be somewhat challenging. These gorgeous colors sometimes, and they get huge. This was taken down in Saco, where we found these great big Tylopolis fruit. Here's one that came a lot last year that has a look-alike. It's lovely edible, and Tylopolis alboater on the bottom left there, also a good edible. I don't eat a lot of Tylopolis, because in the middle of that is the Tylopolis, what was Tylopolis eximius. And the Boletus genus are the ones that are left. And we're going to talk about the Boletus edulis group. And they're pretty varied still. Some of them stay blue, some of them don't. Pore surface variously colored. Some of them have beautiful net veining on the stalk, some of them don't. So it's a mixed group. So these are some of the genus Boletus, and we'll talk about a couple of these in more in depth. Here's these two, vermiciculoides and vermiculosus. When they first open, that pore surface is a deep, deep brown, gorgeous, and then it becomes reddish brown as it ages, stains quickly, and the top left there is a great example of reticulation gone wild. And it was interesting, that was one mushroom in a group. The rest of them had a regular reticulation, but that was just beautiful. I'll talk about some of those in specific. So there's a bunch of other genuses, generally. Tons. I'm not even going to go through these.
Oh.
We'll talk about some of them specifically that are interesting, but I just wanted to acknowledge that. So these are the ones where you're going to want to learn. They're good to start with and good to move on with. We're going to start with the king bolete. Everyone wants to find it. And there's a good reason. It's a really lovely apple. The king bolete, as I said, tons of different common names in different countries. We got all caught up about, all right, is this still Boletus essentialis? Is it something different? You know, is it Boletus chippewayensis? You know, here in the northern part of New England, we have about 5 or 6 common species that fit into this porcini group. Who the hell cares which are which? You can get into your ego and you can choose on that, or you can choose not to. So closely related, really wonderful to collect and eat. You have to get ahead of the bugs.
Yeah.
When I'm collecting boletes, oftentimes I'll bend down and I'll start with the stem and I'll squeeze it before I ever pick the mushroom. And if it feels really soft, I leave it, because that means there's a lot of maggots in there. But I'll talk about some of them. So as a group, they always have that hamburger bun shape, some shade of brown. I'll give you a range of shades in a minute. That pore surface underneath the cap when it's young, it's pure white. And you can't see the pore opening, so they call them stuffed. And as it ages, it goes from white to pale yellow to greenish yellow to off green. Because the spore color is olive brown. And none of these, with one mild exception, stain blue.
Huh.
So if you stain blue, it's not in this group. And they all have more or less, I'll show you a better picture, some of that reticulation, that pattern of net veining on the surface of the stem. So here's a mature one on the top left that really shows that deeper mature color. You can see on the top right some of the faint net veining in the upper half. Yes?
Could you still eat it at that stage?
At that stage, if it doesn't have bugs in it,
Yeah.
I often will peel off that tube layer and I'll dry it. I usually won't eat it and cook them fresh. At that point, you could, but the texture would not be wonderful.
Yeah.
And here you can see, I'll show you a better picture, much more deep pattern of that net veining. Easy. So, again, just the range. Sometimes, particularly under planted trees, this was underneath some spruce in Rockport, where a relatively small area can fruit very heavily sometimes. And they often, porcini means little pig. And it refers to often when they're young, you've got a really fat, rounded stem and a small, by comparison, cap, little pigs. They call that, when they're very young, they call them champagne corks. And they're really highly prized. They're dense, they're great for roasting at that stage. This is a picture, so this is from the same spruce plantation, same forest. And the range came from very, very pale, off-white, tannish, to very, very deep, reddish brown, all in the same forest the same day. So that variation can happen, all the same species. And from that same forest, you can get a bunch of them at the same time. So here, when I collect these, I pluck them from the ground, and then I'll cut off the base that has all the dirt on it. That also gives me an absolute indicator how many bugs are in it. And if there's just a few, I'm going to bring it home. If anything, I'll dry it at that point. If you ever buy those dried boletes, you're going to see those signs of some of the bug holes. It's a choice point. If you say no friggin' way, they're your mushrooms. It's no friggin' way. So, and I put this as a very busy slide. So this is based on some work that was presented this past year about kind of revisioning what we call the porcini group of boletes. And we were so busy throwing out Boletus edulis. He says, well, really, if you look at it, the relationship genetically to the Boletus edulis in Europe and the ones here, there's an overlap. So it's really valid to still call these Boletus edulis. And there's some other variations within that. And you can spend the next 10 years really diving in here and build a lot of knowledge. And at the end of it, you'll still be eating the same mushrooms. That's the important part of curiosity. So, and this is my caution slide. That's a great Boletus edulis. That is an Amanita granulata.
Yeah.
And I should have taken the picture before I picked it, but that was just tucked right in, growing at the base. Always use your observation skills. Always see what you see. So examine each mushroom. So a couple I want you to know. This one, it's called the yellowfoot bolete or chromefoot bolete because of that bright chrome yellow stalk base. It's a kind of a bubblegum colored cap when it's young, and the stalk is also that faint pinkish scabers on it. Grows with hardwoods, very distinctive. Often starting early to midsummer, and then ending by September-ish, more or less. When you collect it young and firm, it is a really lovely apple, and very distinctive. As it ages, the cap goes from that bubblegum pink to kind of tan, innocuous color, but that base of the stalk, always that bright yellow. And the pore surface goes from white to kind of dingy white over time. When they're young and still firm, lovely texture, lovely flavor. I cooked up a bunch of these for the class we had in Eagle Hill a few years ago. We tried several, and the class said, oh man, these are just wonderful. So that's the yellowfoot. You don't find them a bunch in one place. You might find 3 or 4. Through a walk, you'll find enough to make a meal. So the chestnut bolete, yes.
Are there any lookalikes?
The reasons I'm telling you these is because they're so clear. So no real lookalikes, but that combination of features, they're very distinctive. The chestnut bolete, again, very distinctive. You can collect them from this big to about 3.5 inches most, with that very white pore surface that gets dingy as it ages. This has a yellow spore print. So if you do a spore print, you get yellow. And that stalk that is, again, mahogany colored, if you cut it open, it's kind of stuffed. It's not solid. It can be partially hollow sometimes. Sometimes you can find these in huge numbers. And it's a really flavorful bowl. There are a lot of these around last year. Gyroperis, you'll oftentimes see as Gyroperis castaneus. And now it's been, since that's the European name, they call it borealis, but still the chestnut bolete. There's nothing else that really looks like this one. Very distinctive. And here that really shows the range of sizes. And the painted bolete, another very distinctive swillis. This is one of the swillis that has that partial veil, and very angular yellowish pores. I see this in conifer woods in a dry year when there's nothing else fruiting. It's on the edges of wetter areas. You can see large numbers of it consistently, sometimes from the end of June straight through to the end of September. I would never call this an incredible bolete, but it's very edible. When you cook it, some of the swillis and lexinums will darken with cooking. This one, it gets a dark burnished bronze. It's really a lovely color and a fairly good flavor. Very distinctive. And that deep red color when it's young, as it grows and expands, it lightens because those scales that are the color get spread apart and you see the flesh bit between them. And this guy, I don't know what you can say about it. It's so distinctive. They call this the Russell's bolete. It's been thrown across so many different genera recently, but it's so distinctive. That tall, thin stalk and a relatively small cap And the stalk is that flesh colored with this just exaggerated shaggy reticulations. And the cap is like a really fine suede. It's dry, it has that suede texture, very distinctive. The pore surface are kind of greenish and they will slightly stain. I find it with oaks. All right, disclosure again. How many people like the texture of okra? You'll love this mushroom. The stalk especially is that slightly viscid texture. My wife does not appreciate that. I love it. So quite flavorful. It's just really beautiful. Sometimes I can find them in pretty good numbers, as we see here. And so these photographs were taken under oaks outside of Belfast. It's an area I often visit because it's a stand of mature oaks that give a wide range of different species fruiting, including this one. And here's the bicolor. Learn it slowly, get to know it with some distinctive features. It is such a good mushroom. So that combination of typically bright to even dark red when it's young, stem and cap, and the stem shades from dark red at the base up to yellow by the apex, and sometimes it forgets to get to yellow occasionally. And no scales or hairs. That pore surface is bright yellow and will stain blue pretty quickly. And the flesh inside is yellow. It almost never stains. Occasionally it will slowly get bluish. A couple other pieces. It's pretty typical for the margin of the cap to be irregular. A little bit enrolled and irregular. And if it has bugs, the bug holes stain red. And the tube layer on this is pretty thin. So those combination of features. They like oaks, and they're pretty loyal. So there's a couple oak trees that I visit every year. There's one woman who's got these huge oak trees that are rich with this. And I think she's seriously introverted. And I never see her, but I always knock on the door and ask permission. And she always gives me permission. And sometimes she opens the door, sometimes she doesn't. But when I find these, it's just such a good oak. And if you dry them, that same color, bright yellow, bright red, stays through the drying and through the cooking afterwards. Worth learning. And there's a lot of lookalikes. So these are all lookalikes to that bicolor. I'm not even trying to name them. And some of these are known to be edible, and some of them will sicken you. So, just learn the bicolor, for sure. And so we're going to just do a couple whoops. I don't know what happened there. This is one, Lexinum, Hemilexinum subglide, it's called the lemon boat leaf. The lemon boat because of the color of the pores and the stalk, as well as it's got that slightly tangy taste to it. And I find this sometimes with firs, and I find it also larger ones under birch. It's got a kind of that yellowish tan stalk, no staining reaction at all. The yellow stalk, or yellowish tan cap, and the yellow stalk sometimes has some reddish in it. Very distinctive. Nothing else looks like it. And I don't know a common name for this one. The bolete book this year, they call it the curvy stem bolete. I call it the long curvy stem bolete because Longicurvipes is its specific epithet, and it's so distinctive because the stalk often does this, a little bit in this shape, as it matures. Long and thin, with that yellowish brown cap, no staining reaction under oaks. Some years I find this in huge numbers. This used to be linked with the scaber stalks because it has these kind of orangish reddish scabers when it's young especially. And oops, I thought I had a bigger picture of that. It's just a lovely flavor. The cap is a little viscid, but nice taste to it. Nothing else looks like it. And this one, oh man, if you find, they call this the lilac bolete. Some years I don't find it at all. And then there's a year when it's all over the place. 2 years ago, it was all over the place. So this one can be quite large. You can get 8 inches or more, starting out with that gorgeous kind of reddish pink cap, and always a blush of that same color on the stalk. White pores that go yellowish toward maturity with oaks. And this one, it has the net veining that sometimes you really have to look at it because it's white on white. Very distinctive though, considered a very much of a choice edible.
Is that, the prior slide was the red color of it, a young one almost looks like a Rosella? Like the secondary Rosella?
But it would always have the pores rather than gills.
Right.
Yeah.
If it's young, you might not get to see too close, but yeah.
Well, if you're going to bring it home for dinner, you definitely be up close and personal with it. Yeah. So just beautiful mushrooms and very distinctive and so flavorful. You really see that net veining in that center top one.
Yeah.
And the one on the left, you can see there's some variation, almost brownish reddish. So they don't read the books always.
Greg, do you ever think that, because there is a lot of variation in the color of a single one, do you find them to be different in different forests or if they're different trees? Or?
Sometimes in different areas or different, there's variation. And that's why as you're getting to learn them, take your time before you start eating what you want as you learn. This little brown spotted bolete is an early summer one that took me a while to eat. Often it'll come and then dry and you get these cracks. Quite beautiful and a bright yellowish orange spore color. It's a lovely edible. Take your time learning. And this is, I'm going to talk about the toxins. Before I let you out of here, I have to talk about these. A couple more minutes. So the ones you want to talk about, you want to learn here, is that lilac brown bolete that sickened me. Beautiful. Just freaking gorgeous. Particularly when it's young, you've got that purple tones to it, and then it gets much more brown. Same core surface, kind of purplish when it's young, and then it gets quite brown. Here on the left it's young, here it's more mature with some young ones. This was under that same oak that Russell's bolete was, or same group of oaks. And it's just beautiful, distinctive, and there should have been some warning. It never gets buggy. It never gets buggy. And this one is Boletus heronensis. No common name other than I'm calling it now the Hurling bolete. And what I've run into several situations with people from Europe believing this was a young porcini, the button. And it's big. The button stage can be this big. And the mature stage, I've seen it up to about almost a foot across. Beautiful. It's got this warm cap. But unlike the porcini that has a white pore surface, never starts out yellow and never blue. This one always, the pore surface stains blue. And the flesh often slowly stains blue, and the flesh is yellow as well. Likes hemlocks and other conifers, more common further north in New England. And it's big. It's tempting to want to make it edible. And they say it develops this watermark, which is a vague term. It means there's a place where the stalk kind of stops being brown and gets more yellowish. It's not always distinctive. But that staining, the yellow, the lack of any net veining on it should be very clear. And so I use this as a warning. Don't eat them. There have been some folks seriously hospitalized with this one. And the Lexinum, I just wanted to make, again, I talked mostly about the scaber stalks. If you do choose to cook them well. Yes?
If I didn't want to eat it, can I still pick it and not get sick?
That's a really good question. Thank you for asking. You will never be sickened by a mushroom you don't eat. There are some where you can have a reaction. Some of the viscid ones, if you've got really sensitive skin, can cause a rash. A few things like that happen, but pretty unusual. I rarely run into it. I just want to show you the old man in the woods. So cool. So also edible. It's just so distinctive mushroom. There's a couple of them. So what do you need to do to move forward? Get some learning materials. This may be intimidating. Most field guides have a few bow leads. That's a good way to start. There is a field, I'll show you in a second. But patience and judgment are really good. I've got in my second book a few copies available here. I don't really deal with the bow leads. It's not necessarily a resource for the bow leads other than I talk about the Foraging. But some other resources, I talk about the bow lead book. There is a synoptic key online. It's called the bow lead filter. That can be really helpful. It takes a while to learn how to use it. They really try and do their best to keep up with the recent nomenclature changes. I use a couple of different websites. Mushroom Expert is a great resource. Now, Michael Kuo will give no statements about edibility or toxicity. That's okay, that's his choice. If you at all comfortable with French or use translation, get Michael Quebec online. There's a real rich resource of species. It's a constant resource for me. I usually don't translate because the translations are kind of funky, but my French is horrible. Very helpful. And there's some other more in-depth patience. Patience if you're thinking about eating. Patience and more patience. And good ego strength if you're arguing people about species. So other than that, on a broad level, the mushrooms of Eastern North America, Kim Barones is more recent, and he deals with a lot of little mushrooms. He's a neat author. And Bill Rudy, who was co-authoring on the bow leads of Eastern North America, also has an older book, Mushrooms of West Virginia and the Appalachians, that is surprisingly useful up in this region. So, and I will continue. In fact, I'm doing more classes than ever this year, so I'm mostly retired from my other work. I'm going to be going out on Hurricane Island for a weekend thing, and I'm also Maine Hudson Trails, foraging and food weekend last year that I'll be teaching at this year, weekend of July 20th to 21st. So, and a bunch of day-long workshops around the city. And then, really, always, recognize mushrooming is an opportunity to be in the woods, to be in nature, to kind of quiet the noise. So make sure you take care of that. Following John Muir, absolutely. Another old white guy.
That fossil, that's one of the red ones you can eat, right?
Yes. And I love this. You can see the little droplets on this right here. For a while, they put this in its own genus with a few others that's called Exudioporous, which means really young, you get these droplets of liquid on the pore surface. They threw it out, so in the butter bubbles, but boy, is it beautiful. It's quite tangy, but very distinctive. I don't see it often enough to have it as a regular edible for me. Questions?
Yeah, so when you, like the old man would maybe think of it, when you eat bullies, do you often eat the stem or sometimes you don't? Because like for that one, like it's like, it's not great on that one. Or more
Typically, I will eat the stem on any bow leaf, but that one is, you also look at. So recognize that when you get them home, they're your bow leaves.
Right.
You decide, based on your interest in what looks appealing or feels appealing to you.
Yeah. So you just all like isolated, like coin medallion thing.
Yeah. Like that Russell's bow leaf that's slimy, you cut those into little sections like you would a vegetable. They're a neat texture and flavor. Play.
Yeah.
Particularly in the cooking. But always cook them well. Easier to digest that way.
Talk a little bit about that, because I'm never really sure.
3 or 4 things. Some kind of warm brown heavily bun. Pore surface that are white and then aged toward yellow toward green. Net veining on a fine context of white flesh. Yeah, those are the keys.
And there was a white foray that I believe that I had never seen that didn't have a bunch.
Probably Suillus placidus. Gorgeous. There's a couple of white buildings. They don't see very often.
How about the black bully? Because I have come across a gorgeous, like, velvety-looking black bully.
That is probably Tylopolis alba. I don't find it very often. It's gorgeous. With a white pore surface. Yeah. So thank you very much for coming. Oh yeah, I didn't
I
get to.
have one question, more art related than anything. How long does the stain last, the spore stain? Can I
It varies.
that?
Often it goes from that blue, and they'll say, the description will say, stains rapidly blue, ages to brown, or ages, fades to brown kind of thing.
Okay, thank you.
So take a picture of it when it's fresh, and then use that for your art.
Yeah, got it. So encouraged.
So I've got a few books. Also, I'm going to be putting out a schedule for I'm teaching around the state. So I've got a email sign-up sheet up here if you want, with some cards. Enjoy the rest of this thing. I'm really pleased with the number of people who came out for the voting today.
Yeah.